Can Prowess be cut down? Are Pixies going extinct? And what won the most in the room at SCGCON? Coming up right now. We're getting some rapid fire RCs as the one in Minneapolis at SCGCON just wrapped up, and there were a lot of different standard decks that were being slung just between this weekend and the last one. So in this video, like always, we are going to be going over the RC as a whole and what decks were in the room. Then we're going to be narrowing it down a little bit more and looking at the popularity of those decks and then describing them and comparing them against one another within their popularity tiers, shifting gears a little bit to look at the top 10 win rate decks, regardless of how many people decided to bring them to Minneapolis. And then we're going to be stepping back and taking a look at the head-to-head matchup matrix on the top 10 presence decks at the regional championship. So stick back and let's kick into high gear as we go over some stats from yet another RCQ in Standard. Now again, just a quick little explanation of where the data comes from, as we are using Melee Platform's tournament report, which has 1,365 players with 1,365 decks. But I did find 3 troll deck lists which I weeded out. An Orzhov list which had 28 of each land and 4 Bologna, a mono red monument list which had sort of a list but had 11 islands in the sideboard and did concede round number 1, and then colorless Convoke, which was 25 mountains, 20 plains, and 15 islands, which I guess all have to tap to cast its spells. But other than that, I have not touched any of the archetype names, although SCG and Fanfinity from last weekend have some different nomenclature for their decks, which does make me a little sad. It makes it harder to just compare them one-to-one super easily. Now, I've made sure not to count any buys, but intentional draws do still count in these records, and I am not touching the top 8 matches for this data set like I did for the RC and Bologna last weekend as well. This is all just Swiss round stats. So rapid fire info on this so we can jump right into the data. All in all, at SCGCON Minneapolis, there were 89 different deck archetypes after taking out the troll lists, and 42 of them were the only copy in the room at the RC, which made up about 47.2% of the metagame. Now, 17 different archetypes had at least 2 copies in the room, which means 19.1% were duos, and then 2 different archetypes had 3 copies being played, although on this graphic you'll see that there are 3 because the troll list, I grouped them all together, but only counting those 2 actual deck types was a 2.3% share of the room. Now, 3 different decks had 4 copies sleeved up for 3.4% of the RC haul, while 4 different archetypes had at least 5 copies played for a sizable number at 4.5% of the room. That of course means that there were 20 different archetypes with 6 or more copies at the RC in Minneapolis, accounting for 22.5% of the players there. Now, of all these decks, there was far and away a most popular one. Izzet Prowess was almost a third of the room, with 447 pilots cantripping their Cori-Steel Cutters. Jeskai Oculus was a distant second most played with 170 copies and a respectable 12.5% of the metagame share, which is far more normal to see from a deck. Mono Red Aggro, despite some typos on early broadcast graphics, was the 3rd most played deck with 104 copies in the room for 7.6% of the metagame share, which is down quite a bit from just the last RC alone. Now, Overlords, aka the Domain deck, had a slightly larger representation than expected, with 97 pilots and a 7.1% metagame share, while Azorius Omniscience also had plenty of pilots in the room, making up 6.3% of the decks with 86 copies at the RC. Jeskai Control was still kicking around the top of the metagame and the top of the tournament with 73 decks and a 5.3% share of the metagame, while a different type of control-ish deck in Mardu Pixie saw a slight uptick in the metagame share as 46 players made up 3.4% of Minneapolis's meta. Dimir Midrange continued to be sleeved up after a below average showing last weekend, but a good matchup into Oculus in particular. 40 pilots wanted to see if 2.9% of the room would repeat that success. Esper Pixie, though, fell all the way down to 9th most played with 35 decks and just a 2.6% of the metagame share, as the blue splash has fallen out of favor compared to staying Orzhov. while a different type of deck dropped the white as well in mono black demons using only one color, look to leverage Unholy Annex, Shieldred, and plenty of destruction spells in the hands of 32 pilots and a 2.3% metagame share. Other decks to call out from the room are the Abzan Pixie list that was bouncing baby siege rhinos, aka skirmish rhino, for pure value, with 10 pilots and a 0.7% of the metagame share, as well as pointing out the Azorius Artifacts deck looking to synthesize some wins for 7 pilots, aka 0.5% of the RC players, and Orzhov Amalia, taking the Pioneer combo piece in a different direction with 4 pilots and a 0.3% of the room playing it. Let's continue our discussion about how many decks were in the room by shifting to look at deck popularity and how different decks compared within their tiers. Now, for those that are newer here, popularity is something I've come up with that is used to rank the decks at each event with a letter grade from D tier up through S tier based on where they fall for that event's standard distribution of deck archetypes. Sounds a little mathy because it does use a little bit of math, but what this looks to show is not only how likely you are to encounter these decks on your own Magic the Gathering online or RCQ grind, but also take a bit of a closer look to see if popular also means powerful, or if they fell a little flat. Alone in a tier of its own at S tier is Izzet Prowess, the deck everyone expected to be the most played archetype, but not by this much. With almost a third of the room, the amount of prowess at the event skews the distribution so hard that you're gonna need more than just double digits to have your deck archetype register as anything above D tier. But with so many copies of the deck and so many people playing it, the deck did fall prey to what I'm going to call 50-50 syndrome or popularity crisis. This is where not only did the deck have an abnormal amount of mirror matches played, but with so many people playing the deck, practiced, or for the first time, the deck averages out on all sides to hit a closer to even win rate than if less people had picked it up overall. Now, this isn't anything official statistically, more so just what I've noticed with other popular archetypes in the past, and having an above 50% win rate is already a testament of strength to the list with so many different players playing it. But it is noteworthy that this win rate is much lower than decks that have had that B-ban word thrown around at them, such as the Temur Breach deck did in modern events. That's where the adjusted win rate comes into play, where we can see that if you were to pick up the deck and jam it at an event like this, it is 95% likely that you would fall between a 46.1 and a 55.4% win rate, which is cool to see the band so small because of the sample size of decks we have. So is the deck strong? Hell yeah it is, brother, but it's not unbeatable despite a large amount of players thinking it gave them the best shot to win the event. Now, due to said skewing of the distribution from prowess, Jeskai Oculus sits alone at our A tier when it had 12.5% of the room, something that might normally be putting it closer to S tier. Now, regardless of its popularity and its presumed good matchup into prowess, the deck overall just fell under 50% win rate in the Swiss stage of the RC this time around, no small part due to how many more players picked it up this go around. Now, it's hard to say if the deck is a better choice than others around it since it sits on a popularity tier of its own, but I personally was an advocate for picking it up going into this RC, so I wouldn't count it out as far as power level goes quite yet, especially when we take a look at its head-to-head matchups later on. B tier gets stacked with 4 different archetypes this time around, including a couple of ones that have fallen from once being the S tier at these type of events. Xur Overlords and Mono Red Aggro both had A tier worthy pilots, but more along the lines of C or D tier grade performances, with Mono Red Aggro falling even further down to a 46.9% win rate overall. Meanwhile, the newer crop of decks in Azorius Omniscience and Jeskai Control grew in metagame share, while Omni specifically was the winner of the B tier decks as far as win rate goes, matching prowess at a 50.7% win rate and putting the most archetypes in the top 8 of SCGCON's RC. C tier is looking a little like an archetype graveyard, as decks that have been floating around since the last RC season are slowly declining in win rate and play rate. Namely, Esper Pixie at just under 50% win rate with 35 total decks. Orzhov Pixie did have more players than at RC Bologna, but despite the uptick in prowess decks, it ran into a wall against specific decks we'll talk about later on, falling even lower than Esper and win rate at 47.2% for this event. Potentially, it's time for these decks to shift away from the Pixies and go back to their roots the same way that Dimir Midrange has, surging itself to an overall 51.7% win rate and triumphing over almost all the other decks in these tiers. If it weren't for semi-newcomer Mono Black Demons rocking a 52.7% win rate and slamming down Unholy Annex thanks to the decreasing number of said Pixie players. Now, Azorius Control seems to be losing the battle to its cousin Jeskai as far as controlling shells go, while the Gruul Mice is dwindling in players, but having a slightly better time than its mono-red relative with a 47.5% win rate, still not looking the greatest though. Now that we've gone through what was popular in the room, let's weave our way through all the decks and pick out the ones that did the most winning at the RC, regardless of how many copies were actually there. Now, a quick reminder that sample size does matter, and when looking at these decks, I am not advocating for them being the strongest decks of the format, just something for brewers and innovators in the format to keep their eyes on. Additionally, this was a 2-day event with a cutoff of 18 match points in order to make the second day, so decks with 5 wins did not make that cut, unless they also had 3 ties. So be wary of that when we are looking at these lists and their overall records and performance. Starting off, we have an Oculus deck splashing for a different color than red, still using the Helping Hand and Recommission package, but going back into black as the third color for a pair of powerful legends in Ketramos the New Dawn and Zoraline Cosmos Caller. Now, the God can synergize extremely well with a hardcast Oculus, while the Bat Legend is able to recur the Eye from the graveyard herself if our opponent doesn't stop her from connecting. Sideboard allows us for Pest Control, and Preacher the Schism into the aggressive matchups thanks to the Black Splash, while Monastery Mentor, the OG and not the sword version, hangs out for when you become a more spell-heavy deck. Golgari Roots is a deck that I personally enjoyed during the last RCQ season and finds itself the second highest win rate with 2 pilots playing the exact same 75 at the RC. Guess we found the testing partners. Now, this deck has given up the combo aspect of Voldaren Thrillseeker, a Steelmancer Adept, and Tyvar Jubilant Brawler, but still has the core of Insidious Roots, plus cards that want to put things in or take them out of our graveyard. Agatha's Soul Cauldron is a nice addition to these more fair versions of the Roots deck, as it allows anything to become an enabler for Insidious Roots, including making all of our plant tokens into Scavenging Oozes, Molt Tenders, or Canker Blooms. Karsi Revenant is a new addition to the deck that provides the best of Empire Nighthawk we've ever seen, while it can turn an Overlord of the Baelmerk into a flying, life-linking, death-touching menace, while also triggering our Insidious Roots. A Dimir version of Demons had 2 lists, but the one from Pilot Levi 907 did a lot of the heavy lifting, going 11-4-0 in the main event itself. The deck doesn't have any actual demons in it though, and plays like a Dimir mid-range deck, only jamming 4 copies of Unholy Annex and leveraging the Soulstone Sanctuaries that the deck was usually running anyway as its lone demons. Now, Deep Cavern Bat comes back into the mix alongside Spyglass Siren and Floodpitch Drowner as a way to get Kaito into play, while copies of Intimidation Tactics play well alongside Duress as a way to hit Cori-Steel Cutters as well as any potential creatures from the aggressive lists in a pretty solid Despise/Thoughtseize cosplay for the format. In similar fashion to the deck it's tied with in normal win rate, Mardu Pixie had one deck do the heavy win rate lifting as Pilot the Duck Butt was 11-4-0, deciding to smash the Pixie archetype with Cori-Steel Cutter and Fear of Missing Out to string together recursive, multi-combat turns with Prowess Monks and growing threats thanks to Optimistic Scavenger's eerie ability. Sideboard specialties in red, such as Abrade and Urabrask Forge, gave the deck new angles of attack that Orzhov and Esper Pixie decks don't usually have the ability to run, making it stronger into opposing Cutter decks and black-based grindy matchups. Pilot David Boucher put together a list with my favorite words in the name, Mono Black, but gave it two distinct flavors. The first of which is the namesake game plan was to reanimate the big bad Valgavosi itself, aka Valgavoth Terror Eater, from the graveyard. But there wasn't a Cruelty of Gix or a Zombify in sight. Instead, David utilized the second flavor of the deck, Clerics Matter. Cards like Null Priest of Oblivion and Valgavoth's Faithful are both reanimation spells on a stick, with the Faithful Cleric being a solid flavor win, but it can also work in tandem with Shadowrite Priest as a way to go wide in a pinch with the Lord effect for clerics, but also to creativity-esque search our library for Valgavoth, Harvester of Misery, or Sheoldred in post-sideboard games to make the deck resilient to graveyard hate. Honestly, love the spin on the archetype, and I'm stoked to see if I can piece the deck together to play myself. So I'm not entirely sure how Zebra, or Zebra 4 with a 4 instead of an A, was the only one to think of this, but hey, hats off to him. Questing Druid is the only main deck green card in this Temur twist on Izzet Prowess, getting the nod over Hearth Elemental by splashing an entire color, which does allow for sideboard copies of Pick Your Poison and Paw Patch formation to get played, which notably are great at killing things like flying eyeballs. Now, aside from that though, there isn't much to say. Going down to 2 stock up to find room for the Druid seems to have paid off in general for the deck, as Zebra went 9, 5, and 1. Speaking of flying eyeballs, this Abhorrent Oculus card seems like it might be pretty good, eh? Azorius Oculus cut the black and dropped a little on overall win rate, but the deck still packed a punch with the reanimation package and Kiora the Rising Tide, alongside the original target of these shells in Haughty Djinn to try and put power in the skies or use the growing graveyard to spawn an octopus every single turn possible. The deck did pack more straight interaction than some of the other Oculus lists, with 4 Soul Partition, 3 Into the Flood Maw, and 3 main deck counterspells, while being heavy on the 25 spell slots meant that Monastery Mentor could make an appearance from this sideboard as well. Temur Cauldron goes back to using Agatha's Soul Cauldron for some combo shenanigans, as it plus Sleep Cursed Fairy allows for any tap-to-use creature with abilities to get a second lease on life, while Rona, Herald of Invasion, will untap with all of our legendary creatures, naturally allowing us to use her multiple times as the ideal thing to place a counter on. Now, Redshift Rocketeer Chief is going to help out immensely here, as the mana generated from this ability can only be used on abilities itself, which is honestly all we need to untap something with Sleep Cursed Fairy under the Cauldron, or let us make tons of mana with Rona. Now, Loot the Pathfinder helps make mana in a pinch, as well as adds a way to burn our opponents out of the game given enough ways to activate the Exhaust ability, while Bristly Bill can make our creatures exponentially large to just swing for lethal with a trampling flipped Rona or a very wide legendary board. Boros Monument had 3 copies at the RSC and still put up a solid 56.8% win rate, as the deck took a slower, grindier approach to what the Jeskai Oculus decks were doing, but swapped the eyeball for more creatures and, most importantly, Monument to Endurance to capitalize on all of the discarding that it wanted to do. Fear of Missing Out, Guardian of New Benalia, Scrapwork Mutt, new card Tersa Light Shatter, and some lists even running Inti, Seneschal of the Sun to keep these triggers going, while Recommission could also be used to bring back monuments that were abraded or discarded to all these other effects. 4 copies of the Mycosynth Gardens meant you could potentially have 8 monuments in your deck, while cards like Sheltered by Ghosts was a catch-all answer to anything your opponents could throw at you. Now, lastly, there were 4 different decks that tied at 55.6% win rate at the RC, but I'm only going to pick one of them to highlight for time's sake and dealer's choice here. Gruul Artifacts in the hands of Joelle Rinkol didn't make day 2, but had some very interesting play patterns as yet another Agatha's Soul Cauldron deck that used a fair game plan of Teething Wormlet and Gingerbrute the way that the old Simic Cookies list used to run, but also had Heartfire Hero, Inti, and Valderan Thrillseeker to pump up the direct damage and trampling aspect of the deck. Able to use Cauldron to turn all the pieces of this puzzle into fling-type threats, the deck just missed day 2 in round 9 against another Prowess pilot. So those were the decks that did the most winning, but let's pivot back to the most present decks and see how they did when put head-to-head against one another. Like winning, but in a different metric. Now, I like to take a look at this specific matchup matrix because it gives us insight into what you should expect to play against if you decide to try one of the top decks, and how it should stack up against your own RCQ, Magic the Gathering online league, metagame, or any other sort of event you're going to go to in just a short amount of time after this video. Again, keep in mind sample size of these matchups, as not every deck played as many games against all the others, especially compared to the Prowess deck. So this is more of a general guideline as to how a matchup may go, rather than a be-all, end-all type of stack ranking. Now, as just briefly mentioned, Izzet Prowess has a ton of matches for us to look at from the RC, which should give us a pretty solid look at how the deck performs, even though there weren't as many copies of those other decks compared to, say, matches of the Prowess mirror. But of note that the win rate of Prowess when you look at non-mirror matches was only 0.7 percentage points higher than its overall record for the event, which isn't too significant. Now, one of the first things that jumps out to me personally is the fact that the matchup between Prowess and Jeskai Oculus has flipped in the slight favor of the Prowess deck, although the matchup is still close to even with a 51.6% win rate for Prowess. The speed of the deck, thanks to spells like Monstrous Rage, pumped up the win rate against decks like the Overlords deck, Azorius Omniscience, Dimir Midrange, and Esper Pixie that went a little bit slower and tried to be grindier, or in the case of the Omni deck, ran a little lighter on main deck interaction. However, being slower wasn't always a detriment to the decks against Prowess if they were packing plenty of removal spells to buy some time, which is exactly what Jeskai Control, Orzhov Pixie, and the Mono Black Demons deck did in order to have winning matchups into the Prowess deck. But even in these cases, if the Prowess deck had the correct draw into the removal being thrown at it, such as multiple cutters versus the Demons deck without having early hand disruption and only spot removal for the board, it still presented a problem. The mono-red decks were also able to get a slight edge in this matchup here, although it wasn't incredibly significant as Prowess still won 49.4% of those matches. Basically, the Prowess deck should continue to be popular, but it doesn't mean that there aren't decks out there that have already geared themselves up towards beating it. The deck itself can be quite resilient though, and will still probably be king of the format for at least the next few weeks. Jeskai Oculus was a deck that I had pointed to at being one that people should be taking up after last weekend that had two glaring weaknesses: the Domain and the Dimir decks. That still held true this weekend, as the Xur Overlords deck in particular was even more effective than in Bologna against the Oculus deck. However, Oculus ran into other issues that we did not see represented in the smaller matrix of data last weekend, particularly in the fact that it lost its slight edge it had in the Prowess matchup. Now, if you watch my recap on Bologna, we went through how the Oculus deck was better suited for the aggro version of Prowess, which ended up being the de facto version of choice both in Bologna and at Minneapolis. But this weekend, it wasn't as good as it was previously, despite very few of any changes between then and now. Now, the surge of mono black Demons decks also posed a problem for Oculus, as cards like Anoint with Affliction coming back are quite good against the deck that can normally outlast certain removal packages by reanimating its threats, but it can't do that when they get exiled. An uptick in Ghost Vacuum type effects or Rest in Peace type effects as well, thanks to other decks like Azorius Omniscience floating around the top of the metagame,
also took a toll on the deck. In surprising fashion, the Esper Pixie matchup also completely 180'd in favor of the bounce deck compared to Bologna, although on paper this one makes much more sense to me being Pixie favored just from my opinion. With the drop off of Pixie decks though, it could just be experienced Pixie pilots sticking with the deck, knowing the matchup better than those that picked up Oculus for the weekend. Now while it did have its struggles, and I am kind of putting a lot of downpour on this, Oculus did still have good win rates against Mono Red, Azorius Omniscience, Jeskai Control, and Orzhov Pixie. While Red is on the decline, the other decks are seeing an uptick in play between last weekend's RC and the SCGCON. So while Oculus might not be as well positioned as I originally thought, it's still a solid choice for larger events where these other decks are going to be present. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Mono Red Aggro was once clamored by many to be taken down a peg with bans, but after 2 weekends at steadily falling sub 50% win rates overall, the deck seems to have been adapted to thanks to other archetypes aiming at the speed that Prowess brings to the table. Jeskai Oculus, Xur Overlords, Jeskai Control, Orzhov Pixie, Dimir Midrange, Esper Pixie, and Mono Black Demons too, all had winning matchups into the mouse-based Menace deck. Most surprisingly though is the Overlords list that had historically struggled against some of the aggro decks and basically required good draws to survive long enough to get online. Red only seemed to have a good time against the Azorius Omniscience deck, which took a little too long to set up sometimes, and surprisingly, Red had a good matchup against Izzet Prowess, although it was only to the tune of a 50.6% win rate, so barely over an even head-to-head matchup. Now, even in that matchup specifically, it seemingly comes down to a matter of speed and what part of the deck each side has drawn, so it's not a foregone conclusion if one is strictly better than the other in that head-to-head either. Xur Overlords, or Domain Overlords, whichever one you prefer to call it, took the 4th most played slot at this event and kept up with its historic Pixie Killer mantra, shutting down the Orzhov version of the archetype almost entirely and boasting a solid 57.1% win rate against the Esper version. Now, in the last section, we touched upon the surprising amount of favor Domain had against the Mono Red deck at this event, while the Oculus matchup was one that Domain had a grasp on even back in Bologna, where Domain gained a good matchup in Mono Black Demons, which had a whopping 72% win rate against, by the way. It had an even more punishing win rate on the opposite side of the Azorius Omniscience deck, which to Domain's dismay were a much larger portion of the metagame at SCGCON. The weaker head-to-head in the Prowess and even in the Dimir matchups makes me think that Domain isn't fully back to the power position it was a couple of months ago, but shows that it still has legs in a standard metagame that is searching for the best answers to the top decks like Prowess. Domain wasn't the only deck that Azorius Omniscience beat up on over the weekend, as the deck had winning matchups into Jeskai Control, Orzhov Pixie, and split the head-to-head against Esper Pixie 50-50. However, the deck had a slight losing matchup to 3 of the most played decks in the room: Izzet Prowess, Jeskai Oculus, and Mono Red Aggro. Makes it all the more surprising that it had the most representation of all of the archetypes in the top 8. Now, both black-based mid-range shells in Dimir and Mono Black sported winning records against the combo-centric deck, as the disruption backed up by tempo style of the Dimir deck specifically was even harder for the Omniscience deck to keep up with, only putting up a 27.6% win rate in those 29 matches played. Jeskai Control did take down the whole event, but was not the most winning deck stats-wise, as it did pack good head-to-head win rates into the aggro decks at the top part of the metagame, a 55.1% win rate against Izzet Prowess and a 54.5% win rate against Mono Red Aggro did look to set Jeskai up for a good spot in the metagame. But, it's always a but, losing matchups into every other top presence deck besides Mono Black Demons meant that the archetype has its work cut out for it when it comes to deck construction. Being built to take down the aggro decks left it open to combo and mid-range shells, tanking to 34.3% win rate against Azorius Omniscience and 38.9% into the Dimir mid-range deck. While Jeskai can be built in different ways, I would caution against taking the list into an open field and would reserve it for a metagame that you think you have a good read on so that you can pick and choose and craft the deck against what you know is going to be played on the other side of the table. Orzhov Pixie was a list that did great against Izzet Prowess last weekend in RC Bologna, and continued to do so here as it put up the highest win rate amongst the top 10 presence decks against the most played deck in the room. I mean, it also beat up on Mono Red, putting up the best win rate in that head-to-head as well. But for the Pixie deck, the fun sort of stopped there. In similar ways to the Jeskai control deck, which, by the way, it also had a slightly favored matchup into, had a losing record into 6 of the remaining top 10 presence archetypes, meaning a rough overall event for the deck that was seemingly designed to stifle these aggressive strategies. A 32.5% win rate into Jeskai Oculus, 34.6 into Azorius Omniscience, and a low 21.7% win rate into the Zur Domain Overlords list meant that Pixie paid the price for being so tech to a specific type of deck. Although it might be able to be built to combat the other decks, the Esper version we cover in a bit just might be a better way to attack those decks if you expect them, and it's just right there, adding a color. So before we get to Esper, let's go from Orzhov to Dimir to cover all of our colors, as Dimir Midrange has been on the up and up in the last 2 weekends, dropping the bounce and prowess cards in favor of the tempo style flying and flash cards it ran just a few months ago. The declining numbers of decks like Esper Pixie, which remains an awful matchup for Dimir here, shown at a 16.7% win rate, although a small 6-match sample size, meant that Dimir's game plan of disruption, backed up by card advantage and a bit of a clock, was able to go toe-to-toe against most decks in the metagame. The one sore spot is the 44% win rate into the Izzet Prowess deck, which is the most played deck, so it's going to hurt the power of Dimir overall. Now, however, Dimir did do well into the other decks at the top of the metagame table: Jeskai Oculus, Mono Red Aggro, Zur Overlords, Azorius Omniscience, and Jeskai Control were all quite favorable head-to-heads for the Dimir deck to battle against, making it an enticing counter-meta counter deck to choose if you're going to any upcoming events. All aboard! Now that the Esper train is arriving at the matchup matrix station, we can see how the smaller amount of pilots that stuck to the deck ended up doing over the weekend. Almost opposite to the Orzhov version of the Pixie list, the Esper version had winning matchups into Jeskai Oculus and was even against the Azorius Omniscience deck. Now, it still struggled against the deck that was seemingly built to fight it in Zur Overlords, but still put up a 42.9% win rate, which, although not great, was a better choice than Orzhov for that matchup. Honestly, Pixie would still be an okayish choice if you looked at this matchup spread if it wasn't for the 43.1% win rate against Izzet Prowess, as the most played deck in the room had 123 matches played to the 147 of the rest of the top 10 presence decks against Esper Pixie. So as long as Prowess and Domain have a home towards the top of the metagame, I expect the Esper Pixie list to stay bottom half of the top presence decks, but not disappear completely. Mono Black Demons is our final top presence deck, as the package of Demons, Unholy Annex, and Sheoldred reared its head from seemingly months of hibernation in the format, punishing the aggressive decks with a combination of card advantage and life gain, while being equally as painful against the cantrips from the Izzet Prowess decks. A 56% win rate against the most played deck in the room, backed up by a 66.7% win rate against the next most played deck in Jeskai Oculus, cements the black midrange shell as a deck to consider going into any upcoming standard events. However, abysmal win rates against the control shells of the format that it currently has, which is the Zur Domain Overlords and Jeskai Control list, mean that this grindy deck can get out-grinded quite frequently. Has a 28% head-to-head versus Zur and a 25% win rate against the 3-color control shell. Going back to 4-mana haymakers like Archfiend of the Dross are great so long as your opponent is playing small to medium threats. but much worse when it's against a bunch of giant overlords that are being activated and swinging in early, or Meringue River region time walking you basically by bouncing the demon and your unholy annex at the same time.
Now, the RC at the SCGCON in Minneapolis was not the only event going on this weekend, but it was the largest, so it does give us the most sample size when it comes to matches for all these different decks. But of course, there were events going on in Japan and Brazil, and there's still plenty of RCs to come before we wind up finishing off the RC season for Standard, and then moving into the RCs people are currently qualifying for at the RCQ season for Modern. So we still have a little bit of time, especially if you are on the East Coast of the United States. I do believe that Hartford is going to be the next RC that is going to be coming up in the East Coast there, native of where I am originally from. But if you guys are going to be playing in that one, let me know in the comments down below if this event has sort of shifted your focus on where you want to be for Standard, and talk about what you are considering or what you were considering previously and what has kind of changed your mind since then. While you're down there, you can give this video a quick thumbs up if you've enjoyed it, so myself and the YouTube algorithm know that you love these event recaps overall. And while you are down there, you can consider clicking that join button down below to become a member to my channel, where you get great membership benefits such as Discord access. You can chat with me all the time about Magic so long as I'm awake, in addition to things like early access to my content and some access to things like personal deck techs and just my input on what you guys are building in different formats: Standard, Pioneer, Modern, maybe Commander or Legacy too, but I'm not an expert in that. But like I said, you can click the join button down below or on my home channel page to help show your devotion. And as always, I would love it if you could just give that subscribe button a quick little tap so you can stay up to date on all the latest deck techs, metagame analysis just like this, and just in general, Magic the Gathering content from me. See you at the next RC.
For those attending, I've secured both my tickets and place to stay for the next MagicCon in Las Vegas for Pro Tour Final Fantasy. See you there, and let's sling some spells.